Hello, everybody. This is Christian Massar again with another episode of the podcast. Another very late one. It's something that I always want to be more diligent in doing, but a lot of other things come up in life. And after all, this is a passion project. It's not a work project or anything. I am a content creator, but I'm not full time. But I do feel I do need to be more diligent in doing so. But I welcome you back for another episode, and I hope everyone's doing well. And imagine, this is actually episode number 49, so we're almost at the big 50. So that's pretty exciting. 50 episodes in 8 years. Could increase the rate, but but that's okay. I'm happy with that. So for those of you who listen, I appreciate it very much, and it's fun to produce these things. It really is. Okay, so what we want to do here is I want to talk about something a little different, something I haven't really talked about before. I'm talking about education. So talking about education. So specifically, what I want to talk about is changes in the curriculum of one Canadian province. So British Columbia specifically. So I grew up in British Columbia. I think you may know that from a previous episode where I talked about the history of the town called Chetwynd, British Columbia. So, I did a project on this recently, sometime last year, about outlining British Columbia's educational ideology. So, let's get down right to it. So again, this is not really a topic that I've talked about before, but I kind of go a little bit philosophical and talk about big ideas in history sometimes. So, education can be a real, how can I say manifestation, or like a way where historical things can be shown. Like, how does a government's ideology show itself in its education, right? So that's something that is definitely worth looking into, and I looked into it a little bit here. Not an extreme example like North Korean. I know how is North Korean Juche ideology taught in North Korean schools? Nothing like that. But just like, what about British Columbia and kind of the changing ways of education, the changing thought around education. So let's get right into it. So in September 2016, British Columbia launched its new provincial K through 9 curriculum. So K through 9, for anybody who might not know, who might be outside of America or Canada, K through 9 means kindergarten through grade 9. So ninth class or ninth year. So from kindergarten up until high school. And over the next 3 years, new courses were added to grades 10 through 12 as well. So all the way to the end of high school. However, online consultations on these educational changes had begun in October 2011 in order to collect ideas from the public for the new curriculum. So this kind of was a process of, so the new curriculum was launched in September 2016, but there were consultations up to that point for 5 years. The new educational system was meant to make, quote, education more relevant, engaging, and fit for a changing world. That is according to Amelia Peterson, writing for the Brookings Institute. And so today in this podcast, we'll be looking at this new BC curriculum. So what were its goals? What did it change? And finally, did it indicate a shift towards neoconservative ideology? According to a Brookings Institute report by London Interdisciplinary School co-founder Amelia Peterson, the new BC curriculum was built from the bottom up, as opposed to the Albertan, Ontario, and many U.S. state educational systems which had been built from the top down. BC's new system was designed with the backing of teachers, the Provincial Teachers Union, and influential educators such as faculty and curriculum experts. British Columbian teachers would be able to integrate their, quote, own experiences and materials into their classes, in turn allowing them to develop specific course content for individual students. So kind of allowing teachers to implement their own materials and experiences into their classrooms. So not just sticking to a specific curriculum like do this, but adding their own kind of experience into it. A key component of the new curriculum is the idea of, quote, core competencies. Through the previously mentioned public consultations, a few core competencies were identified. In her Brookings Institution report, Amelia Peterson again wrote that these core competencies were the following, quote, communication, creative and critical thinking, and personal and social responsibility, later to evolve to include positive personal and cultural identity, end quote. The BC Ministry of Education also lists additional sub-competencies, which are divided into 6 profiles that help teachers evaluate students. Through these competencies, students may choose which skills to utilize or exhibit through the completion of classroom tasks. So here, the idea here is to help students do classroom tasks through their abilities, through these competencies. Rather than being, quote, forced to simply finish universal common tasks, students under the new curriculum have more freedom to focus on specific competencies that they choose. Student exercises are meant to demonstrate how well the students can apply critical thinking, how well they can communicate, and how responsible they are, right? So again, how well are they applying these competencies, these of critical thinking and communication? In turn, teachers can also use the competencies to tailor a student's learning to help develop his or her essential skills. As for assessment, like grading, student skills are evaluated through a set of criteria relevant to each class. And math teachers will be expected to help students develop their comprehension, reasoning, and solving skills, right? So math have to deal with comprehension, reasoning, and solving, right? Such assessments would be according to the discretion or decision of teachers who could decide to, quote, mix and match the criteria they would use to assess students' work. So what were the goals of this new curriculum? So we can already see that the new education program was designed to be, quote, more child-centered, personalized, and inquiry and project-based, according to Peterson again. Rather than concentrating on the rote memorization of facts, the new curriculum aims to help students grasp ideas and processes more comprehensively and deeply. It is thus meant to encourage lifelong learning. Student test results become less important in evaluating a teacher or a school's quote-unquote performance. In the words of Canadian education experts Hong Fu, Tim Hopper, and Kathy Sanford, the new system, quote, reduced the need for high-stakes testing. And so the redesigned curriculum was more holistic. It fits Hu, Hopper, and Sanford's report entitled, which they called, New BC Curriculum and Communicating Student Learning in an Age of Assessment for Learning, which details such holistic assessment models. So doing things as a whole, right? So their research actually went a bit further, suggesting that such high-stakes testing is actually disadvantageous to students for the following reasons. Test preparation, rather than learning, becomes the classroom's activity's ultimate goal, right? So if you're focused on a test rather than learning material, you are focused on test preparation. It's more like memory. You're dealing more with memory, memorizing a fact rather than actually learning something. So this increases student anxiety and can harm low-performing students' mental health. Education will take on an extrinsic value instead of an intrinsic value. So that is of personal importance to the students, right? For example, so they cite W. Harlan in their study here, and also Deacon Crick. So this research kind of shows that if you focus on test preparation, it just makes students more anxious. And if there's a student who may even do well with learning, may be very smart, but just doesn't test well, just doesn't do well on tests, that's going to create anxiety, and it's going to cause, like I said, it will cause disadvantage, right? So these kinds of holistic assessment models that Fu, Hopper, and Sanford advocate for, more holistic, less test-based, these kinds of systems do not use mere reported grades as assessment tools. They do include grades, but they use all relevant information about the students to help teachers assess the students' learning, even their hobbies and talents. This matches well with the freedom that the new BC curriculum gives students to complete classroom tasks that help them use their individual skills. So in 2020, the former mandatory subject-specific provincial exams for grades 10 through 12 were replaced with 2 literacy and mathematical exams that concentrated on getting students to apply their knowledge, not just know it, not just memorize it for a test, but to actually apply the knowledge that they already have. As I grew up in British Columbia, I had to take provincial exams, but I didn't have to do them for grades 10 through 11, only grade 12. So I'm thinking maybe that changed since I left high school, and now they've changed it completely to get rid of provincial exams altogether. So now they've just replaced it with 2 exams that apply They seem to be a broader exam, right? For literacy and mathematical skills, right? So again, you're applying knowledge. You're not just knowing it for a test and then forgetting it later. So similarly, for younger students, there was something called the Foundation Skills Assessments, or the FSAs. They were implemented to assess grade 4 and 7 students' skills in numeracy and literacy. So the FSAs are a manifestation of the new curriculum's focus on applied learning and student evaluation, in that the FSAs do not affect grades. They are rather simply analytical tools for teachers and parents to determine how students are doing in school and where to proceed next. They are not used to evaluate schools, teachers, or students. So instead of grades and GPA averages assessing teachers and schools and students, it's a broader idea. How well are they learning? How well are they applying their knowledge? Another goal was to broaden the curriculum, turning it into a more diverse and inclusive system. A crucial aspect was the, quote, indigenization of educational content, which attempted to, quote, according to Peterson again, bring Indigenous thinking into the curriculum and culture of schooling. A visit to the BC Ministry of Education's website during describing the social studies program is useful for more information here. So if you go to the British Columbia Ministry of Education's website and look at their social studies program there, you'll see that First Nations experiences are an important part of social studies courses taught in local communities. So it's also suggested that social studies teachers consult with local First Nations societies to see how their local knowledge and cultures may be brought into classroom instruction. Right? So this was what a curriculum brochure described as, quote, place-based learning. That was a brochure that was describing the curriculum. And so it talked about place-based learning. Not everybody everywhere in British Columbia learning the same thing, but a local community, a local teacher reaching out to local First Nations people, right? So such localized learning points back to the goal of creating more personalized and flexible learning environments. Finally, the Ministry Social Studies page provides a link describing the, quote, First Peoples Principles of Learning. As said on the page, this says, quote, the First Peoples Principles of Learning greatly influence the curricula and are woven throughout. They lend themselves well to the social studies curriculum as they promote experiential learning. So again, going back to experience, going back to local knowledge. Perhaps the Indigenous learning principle most relevant to the new curriculum is this one, quote, learning is embedded in memory, history, and story. All right, so this goes back to the history of First Nations people in Canada. So historically, First Nations children had been oppressed and forced to assimilate into Canadian society through Canada's provincial education systems. Right. So, and then the terrible discovery of mass graves on residential school grounds in 2021 was a quote unquote point of no return. There was no way for the new BC curriculum to ignore this painful colonial history. In a quote generational effort to decolonize the educational system, First Nations languages would eventually be taught in the new BC curriculum. So if you look at the website again, so curriculum have been developed for numerous BC First Nations languages, which can be explored on the BC Education website. So local First Nations languages are also being taught. When I was in high school, again, going back a long time, year 2000 to 2006, I don't believe we had any opportunity to learn First Nations languages. From what I remember, all we were able to teach, I was in a distance education system, so it was slightly different correspondence, but all I remember was French, German, and Spanish, and of course English, but I don't remember any First Nations languages being offered, and no Mandarin. When I was doing research for this project, which the podcast is based on, I do remember seeing Mandarin there, so which would make sense because there are lots of Chinese immigrants in BC and descendants of Chinese immigrants. So, but going back to this point of the indigenization, so to speak, of BC education. So in March 2022, it became mandatory for students to take at least 4 credits of Indigenous classes, of First Nations classes. I understand as well that in Canada, a lot of Bachelor of Education programs, like so people studying to become a teacher, they also have to take classes about First Nations. So about countering racism against First Nations people, about the history of First Nations people, and so on. So that's kind of become an unwritten prerequisite. So the historical hardships of BC's Asian people are also acknowledged in the new curriculum. So on a BC Ministry of Education brochure, quote unquote historical wrongs is written as one of the new curriculum's highlights. The following detail is given under that heading. Quote, the curriculum includes the history of Asian and South Asian communities and their contributions to the development of our province, as well as the injustices they experienced. End quote. Such content is reflected in numerous specialized social studies courses. So when we look at grade 12 social studies course offerings, there's not just a generic social studies 12 or history 12, which I did. Rather, senior students can take courses in First Nation studies, Asian studies, social justice, and comparative cultures. Students in BC First Peoples 12, that's a class, will learn the following skills. Quote, make reasoned ethical judgments about actions in the past and present, and assess appropriate ways to remember, reconcile, or respond. And students will also ask if historical figures can be honored for actions considered wrong in modern times. It is easy to notice this effort to connect course content to Canada's Truth and Reconciliation initiatives, which had started after the election of Justin Trudeau in 2015. So you can definitely see how the political environment has changed the curriculum or has affected it, right? So, and this new curriculum came into effect a year after Justin Trudeau was elected, right? Remember, the curriculum was launched in 2016. Trudeau was elected in 2015, and he was talking about truth and reconciliation to help handle the injustices properly that were dealt against First Nations people with the residential schools and so on, right? So you can definitely tell how the political environment, the political initiatives have affected the curriculum. So let's now briefly assess the new British Columbian curriculum, its strengths and weaknesses. So I think there are certainly positive aspects. Firstly, with its focus on students as individuals, they may become, quote, more engaged and more articulate about their learning, again, according to Amelia Peterson. Narrative, not metric, she says, describes the new, more qualitative system. Indeed, and speaking from my own teaching and learning experience from kindergarten to university levels in Canada and abroad, it is important for students' learning to be relevant to them, right? So students should be able to develop and cultivate their own interests, current knowledge, and experiences. Having the freedom to talk about or discover more about something students already have knowledge about or interest in makes it easier to learn and remember. In this way, students can be more passionate about their schooling, and that can endure for a long time. So, like for me, like when I'm learning a new language, it's much easier for me to read something that I can relate to, right? So if I can read something in history, if I can read something in a new language about history, for example, or about religion or something like that, these are things that I'm interested in, right? So I'll be more likely to understand that and build my knowledge on. But if I'm forced to read a physics book in a foreign language, that's going to be a lot more difficult. But so that in this way, if you're able to cater students' learning to their interests, the curriculum to their interests and their abilities, that's a good thing. I think that's very good. That it makes it personal to them. I know that when I've taught students, I would often try to talk to them about things that they knew about, things that they were interested in. So then it made it more relevant to them. So then they were also able to learn it better. But I do see some potential drawbacks in the new curriculum, and I should mention these. An increased focus on narrative and qualitative education may help students relate to the material, as I just said, but critics may bring up the correct point that some things are absolute. Topics and truths in arts and humanities, such as history, religion, and philosophy, can be debated due to students' varied experiences and beliefs. That's very true. Yet even there, some facts are absolute. World War II and the Holocaust happened. The moon landings occurred, and the list goes on. This reality of absolute fact is much more important for science and math. 1 + 1 will always equal 2. The Earth is always round. Gravity always makes things fall, and so on. Student work in mathematics and other absolute subjects need to be assessed quantitatively, not qualitatively, right? So, like, a lot of people may use this as an exaggeration, but just as an example, if you're in a math class and you're talking about the quadratic equation has absolutes. You put in your different inputs and it changes that, but the function still works exactly the same way every time, right? And so this is not the time to talk about, well, what is the meaning of quadratic? If that helps explain the function, okay, but don't use that as a philosophy lesson or as a metaphysics lesson. Quadratic equation is a mathematical equation, and it is absolute in how it works and how it should be applied. You shouldn't apply the quadratic equation to everything, right? So this is not a time to, I really like quadratic equations. I know about it, so I'm just going to use it. No, students need to learn new functions that they don't know yet, right? So in those things, so that's where an assessment that is quantitative, is it right or wrong? That's important. So the Fraser Institute, which is known for being a bit more conservative, has expressed concerns about the increasingly qualitative curriculum. So we can see this in Amelia Peterson cites this, and also Paige McPherson and Joel Ems also talk about this. So regarding grade 10 examination, stated in a report called Worrying Trends in BC's Testing of Grade 10 Students, no illusion as to what it's going to say there. But so the problem brought up in that report by the Fraser Institute, the concern was that standardized tests were scored on a percentage, which would entail much higher stakes in terms of graduation. So while it focused on very low student participation rates in the new assessments, this report also mentioned a worrying and concerning low proficiency in both literacy and numeracy assessments. And this was apparently made worse by COVID-19 related school closures. So again, the Fraser Institute argued that these assessments had much lower stakes, than standardized tests. So due to the qualitative and more abstract nature of the new assessments, it's more challenging to evaluate student work, with terms such as emerging or proficient. I've done that before. I've had to grade students before. And sometimes that is hard. If you say they're proficient or they say they're intermediate, well, what does that mean though? How are they intermediate? What does that mean by they are emerging? Does that mean they're learning? Well, everyone's learning. Someone who gets a 40% on a test is emerging. They are learning, but are they doing it well? Maybe not, right? So using these kinds of qualitative and kind of terms that need to be judged or use your judgment to understand and use, that can be difficult. So teachers under this new model, do not need to teach background information because the new assessments do not, measure content knowledge, according to Michael Zwijgstra. So in conclusion, the Fraser Institute said thus, in making this change from standardized tests to qualitative assessments, the province eliminated the fairest measure of student performance that education stakeholders and policymakers have and replaced it with something far less useful. So Fraser analysts recommended that standardized testing should be brought back since it is higher stakes than an assessment based on qualitative, higher order learning. So standardized tests were also, in the Fraser Institute's perspective, the best way to monitor student progress, especially considering an apparent decline in Canadian students' mathematical abilities, according to the PISA tests, so PISA being Program for International Student Assessment. So from 2003 to 2019, Canadian students were supposedly going down in this test scores. And in another report, the Fraser Institute cites the examples of Manitoba and Prince Edward Island, two other provinces. Manitoba got rid of all tests, but PEI added more, and it attained higher PISA scores. So it should be noted that the BC Teachers Federation, or the BCTF, has argued against the previously mentioned FSA assessments. Remember, that was a sort of form of standardized testing, but it was for younger children. It was newly implemented. So the BCTF said that it was the result of the BC government appeasing the Fraser Institute. In addition to saying that it was not a necessary part of the curriculum, the BCTF called it a divisive assessment tool. The BCTF said it was not helpful, only adding stress, wasting time, and taking away a student's sense of pride and accomplishment due to the standardized test score. So FSA assessment scores are also not made available for teachers or parents, making the assessment less useful. So the BCTF wrote about that, kind of countering the Fraser Institute's call for standardized tests. So before we can end this, we want to answer our last question that I brought up previously. So is the new BC curriculum, is it pushing education in a quote-unquote neoconservative direction? So first, we must define the term neoconservative, which is also sometimes known as neoliberal. Neoconservative, neoliberal, it's kind of interchangeable, which is kind of weird. In an introduction to the history of neoconservative education in Canada, Jerrold, Kachur, and Trevor Harrison noted that neoconservative education emphasized morality, as well as courses in science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM. So the purpose of this was to help the country's economic productivity. Financial austerity is also an aspect of this kind of education or system, sometimes forcing school systems to operate with less resources. Critics of neoconservative or neoliberal educational systems posit that they are set up like businesses with an unhealthy dose of privatization, and students are in turn educated to gain employment in the corporate sector. Taking these aspects of neoconservative / neoliberal education systems into account, I do not consider the new BC curriculum to be neoconservative. It is interesting, however, that the new curriculum's focus on student choice ironically creates a sort of course market, according to Amelia Peterson. Some courses may be interesting for students, but they might not be, quote, deemed adequate preparation for post-secondary education. Also, students may want to sign up for a very interesting or easy class, but not others. Sometimes students, they want to do what's easy. They don't always want to do what's hard or beneficial for them. They just want to do what's easy, get an easy pass or an easy grade, and then there you go. School budgets may then be forced to support the class or teacher where students want to be, leaving other classes neglected. So you can kind of see this rather ironic effect of trying to decapitalize the educational system, make it less neoliberal, less neoconservative, but then it creates a course market in itself by expanding the availability of different types of classes, expanding flexibility. But it kind of creates a course market in itself. So if more students want to do more, I don't know, some kind of poetry class because it's easier than engineering class, then maybe the engineering class won't be supported so much, right? Because students aren't going to there. So it's kind of an interesting effect. However, overall, the curriculum is more focused on the needs and performance of individual students, not groups measured by percentages and standardized tests. It was also designed in light of public consultations, not corporations. The new system aims to be more based on, quote, discovery, not mostly geared towards STEM and, quote, generating more employees for the corporate sector, as critics of neoliberal education will say. It is meant to be geared towards, quote, lifelong learning, not the job market. So as for corporate influence, according to Peterson again, British Columbian teachers have historically avoided funding from corporate social responsibility. So this is in contrast with the case of many universities. So in line with neoconservative ideology and the lowering of government budgets for those universities, universities in Alberta, for example, started relying more on research and development, R&D, marketing, and grants to make money. Right? So that's kind of like the capitalist side of education. Right? And so, but according to Peterson, BC teachers have resisted taking funding in this way. In summary, the new BC curriculum has tried to fix some of the problems with, quote, traditional assessment-based systems. It attempts to make the education more accessible, intrinsic, and interesting for individual students instead of forcing them to follow a more extrinsic standard based on exams and numerical scores. By being less rigid, the new curriculum hopes to turn BC students into lifelong learners, rather than students trying to mechanically pass the next test. So that's what I have for today. But as you can see, it's kind of a bit of a different topic. I haven't really talked about it. Well, I have talked about education, like in the form of historical textbooks. But it's kind of interesting. Again, just making the point that political systems, like the political environment, can change education. There's a lot of talk and debate about things like pronouns and transgenderism and so on in the educational system. And a lot of the debate around that is, kind of like what the ruling political party thinks is right. So in Florida, for example, there have been laws even against teaching certain things and so on. And then this situation with BC, because it was made in the context of truth and reconciliation and so on, and the kind of, I guess, this overall social drive away from mechanical learning and kind of more discovery based learning. I think that's an overall trend. Haven't read too much into that, but that's what I've certainly noticed. So it's kind of an interesting thing how politics can affect education and education can affect politics. So it's like a lot of these things are tied together. So I think that's the biggest lesson that we can take from this study of the BC education system, and that's just one province in one country. So anyway, but that's it for me today. I apologize again if you've been waiting for new podcast episodes. Sometimes I post things on Telegram, but I don't actually post on the post new episodes yet. But I hope to do that more. I always say that, I know, but again, this is a passion project. It's not a full-time project. It's not a full-time job. But I do appreciate your attention, and take care. God bless, and see you next time.